Started a movement across the nation, led in large part by the majority on the Minneapolis City Council calling for dismantling the city's police department.
But a movement is not a plan, and the city is now struggling with a violent crime spike. Tonight, a look at the big picture and why some believe a so-called Minneapolis effect has led to a crime wave in other cities. Here's Tom Lydon of the Fox 9 investigators.
They are never just numbers. They are lives lost forever, futures interrupted, families devastated.
I always want their families to know that somebody cares about all of black lives that we lose. So it's important for me, for them to know.
Lisa Clemens surrounds her outreach office at A Mother's Love with the names of the black men and women killed by gun violence. A former Minneapolis cop, she writes the names of those shot by police in blue.
Do you see the violence in the city right now as directly related to the Abolish the Police movement?
Absolutely, 100%. So when you say abolish the police, we want the police gone, dismantle the police, everything in a negative term. And you think they don't hear that? Now you got cops out there saying, what do I do here? I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't. What do I do here?
And 2020, far from over, is on a record pace for gun violence, with more than 400 shooting victims and 60 homicides. Many of the victims and suspects alike, just kids.
Someone took his life for no reason.
Fatima Green's nephew, Andre Comey, was only 17. Gunned down in front of a gas station. The suspect, another 17-year-old with a gun.
Black people need to stand together and let's say, let's take our city back. Let's stop this with killing our children. We cannot see another young one go down by a gun for no reason. It's not fair.
So much has changed since the police killing of George Floyd, and so little. The homicide dots still follow a familiar pattern, with clusters in near North and Camden on the north side, and Central, Phillips, and Powderhorn on the south side. Communities cordoned off by freeways and history. What has changed is the police response. Not the homicide detectives, but the cops in the street. Short-staffed, beleaguered, and leaving the department in record numbers. Minneapolis police officers are now making 80% fewer traffic stops. Those traffic stops often a key strategy in getting guns off the street.
Well, I think what Minneapolis is seeing is the same thing that's going on all over the country. We're seeing a reduction in proactive policing, and the result is the crime categories that are most responsive to that, essentially homicides and shootings, are skyrocketing all over the country.
Law professor Paul Castle calls it the Minneapolis effect. His analysis of the crime data points the killing of George Floyd in late May, the civil unrest and reduction of proactive policing in Minneapolis that followed, and spread to other cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York. He blames the Minneapolis-inspired crime wave for 710 more homicides and nearly 3,000 more shootings in the U.S. 5 years ago, after the killing of Michael Brown in Missouri, he noticed a similar Ferguson effect. The victims, he points out, disproportionately poor people of color.
We're seeing a reduction in proactive policing, things like stop and frisk, vehicle stops, things that police officers have to initiate. And I think what's going on in Minneapolis and many other parts of the country is police are just pulling back a little bit. They're both literally and figuratively under attack, and as a result, they're simply not engaging in the kinds of activities that are necessary to keep shootings and homicides in check.
But many see those traffic stops as part of the problem. Black drivers in Minneapolis are stopped 54% of the time for equipment and moving violations, while white drivers are stopped 30% of the time. But the black driver is 3 times more likely to have their car searched.
Does this style of public safety have any effect on violence. It feels like it's not.
After 4 months of calling for defunding and dismantling police, the city council is now asking the chief for new solutions.
Sort of flabbergasted by right now is colleagues who, a very short time ago, who were calling for abolition are now suggesting we should be putting more funding and resources into MPD.
High crime and lack of legitimacy cannot exist in the MPD. If we have high crime and we have communities that don't view us as legitimate, that's a recipe for failure.
The new reality is that in some of the highest crime areas, neighbors are no longer calling 911. And in the so-called autonomous zone around 38th and Chicago, police are clearly no longer welcome. Chief Arredondo says the city must start looking at the root causes of homicide, the way accident investigators reconstruct plane crashes.
If we just stay status quo right now, we will end this year with numbers that are absolutely unconscionable that we should have in terms of community violence, but we will go on to the next year. And we won't do a deep dive as a city as to what caused all of those.
But even as the MPD shrinks, the mayor's new budget calls for another $2.5 million for the city's violence intervention program and so-called violence interrupters, people who know the streets and the patterns of retaliation.
But they're basically a reworking of the same well-worn programs that have been used in other cities, many of which do not work.
The Center for Homicide Research has been studying Minneapolis crime patterns for 30 years, establishing strong correlations with poverty, even proximity to liquor stores. But its executive director, Dallas Drake, says the recent crime wave is what he calls recreational violence.
Mayhem is free. You just go out on the street and it just begins, and it can be very organic in that it spreads, and the idea spreads easily that everybody wants in on it. And that, I mean, a riot really is a good example of that.
And it will be worse. I don't care what anybody tell you, it will be worse.
Clemens, who began her career with Arredondo when they were both just rookies, believes he's the right man for the times, a police chief who could strike the right balance, but is also caught in the middle between a crime wave and its relentless numbers and a city council that wants less, even as they ask for more.
Cops who really wanted to be cops will police the city no matter what. They will police the city no matter what. Other cops are like, I got a family to feed. You know, I'm going to go to my 911 calls, but I'm not going to do anything extra. I don't blame them. I don't blame them.